This one's working. Where does this one go?
She's got that.
We'll have to have one pack. I just want to. Hello, everybody. I just want to let you know if you're not already on our mailing list, you can come to the back and sign your name, and I'll make sure that you're.
Oh, no. Oh, yes. Yeah. Try. I'll try.
Is it turned on? What's the number on
Like
it?
2.
Okay.
Trying to get.
Hello. Oh, this works. So we'll put this on.
And we've got just so it's just
Just so that he understands.
yeah.
So one of these can go up front. Does it matter which?
Yes.
And this one is for me for asking questions. Should I? Oh, and also Mary. Oh, thank you. Okay.
I get email. That's good. Sure.
Right. Yes, yes, thank you. Yeah, okay. All right, we'll do this.
Well, welcome. Thank you for showing up for this discussion of our next novel, Here for Another Look. I'm Robert Harrison, took over from Tobias Wolff some years ago, directing Another Look. I have to thank the Humanities Center, as a sponsor of Another Look, also the DLCL, as well as Continuing Studies. And I'd like to thank three major donors tonight. Mary Pope Osborne, as usual, one of the world's great children's stories writer, right? Sonia Cross, and a recent donor, Katie Gibson. And these three graces, thank goodness for women, because Another Look wouldn't survive without these three graces. And thanks to their generosity, we're able to keep this going, at least for the moment. Cynthia Haven, never forget to thank her, and also Robert Edgar, our technician. He always comes up with something to rescue us in moments of technical crisis, as we had here in the Humanities Center. The whole AV system wasn't working either yesterday or this morning, and now we have only one mic that we're going to have to share, but we're going to get through the evening. So today we're going to be discussing a book by Dino Buzzati, who is a major novelist. At least he's considered a major novelist, one of the most important voices in 20th century Italian literature, still very much admired in Italy, Germany, and France, above all, and other places. But for some strange reason, he kind of fell into oblivion after his death in 1970. And that has started to change thanks to the New York Review of Books Classics, which has been publishing or republishing his works in English translation. I'll just mention that in 2003, that New York Review of Books reprinted Buzzati's illustrated children's book, a really fantastic thing called The Bear's Famous Invasion of Sicily. The title alone, you can't resist that. In 2009, it published the first English translation of Poema e Fumetti, poem strip, it's called in English. Buzzati was not only a novelist, in fact, he considered himself primarily a painter and a cartoonist. I thought, I mean, I don't know if he was being ironic, but he claimed that his, writing was a secondary occupation, but he was really a remarkable, not only painter and artist, but also, comic book strips and things of that sort. So most of his books in Italian have his illustrations on the cover. Anyway, his most famous novel is in Italian, it's called Il Deserto dei Tartari, which was first translated as The Tartar Steppe, and then retranslated again by the New York Review of Books as The Stronghold. The New York Review of Books also published a novel of his called The Love Affair. And just last year, in 2024, it published a new translation of the book under discussion tonight, The Singularity, which is really not what the Italian title means. In Italian, Il Grande Ritratto means the great portrait, but there's reasons why the New York Review of Books chose a title like The Singularity. Leave it to you to imagine why. Dino Buzzati, he had a keen interest in science and above all in cybernetics, as you can see, reading this novel. And around the time that he wrote The Singularity, the philosopher Martin Heidegger declared, I want to quote Heidegger here, "No prophecy is necessary to recognize that the sciences now establishing themselves will soon be determined and regulated by the new fundamental science that is called cybernetics." Heidegger was wrong about many things, but he was in fact quite prophetic when he said that. 60 years ago, he was predicting technology's comprehensive takeover of the earth and human relations. And since then, I mean, he wouldn't believe where we've come since then. We have the internet, we have data processing, global positioning systems, smartphones, genome editing, and artificial intelligence. These things have become everyday realities. And nowadays, every aspect of human praxis really goes through a computer. Being in the world, famous Heideggerian phrase, to be human means to be in the world, today means being in a computer, essentially. Part of the fascination of the novel we'll be discussing this evening has to do with its vision of what it means, existentially speaking, to be inside a vast computer network or electronic brain, as Buzzati called it. Reflecting on the atom bomb, Buzzati wrote that what we should fear the most is the moment when the atomic threat no longer scares us. And maybe we could say the same thing about cybernetics. What we should fear the most is the moment when we no longer feel alienated by the way being in a computer deprives us of the embodied existence that Laura, the character in our novel, trapped in her machine, misses and longs for inside her cybernetic reality. Quoting from the book, "Move, why can't I move? My legs, where are my legs? Where are my hands? Where's my mouth? Blood, how come I can't hear my blood pounding through my veins? Help, who trapped me here?" I don't want to get hyperbolic and say that we're all trapped in the same kind of machine that she is in, but it would only be a little bit of a stretch to say that. So we have some very interesting guests joining us tonight. Laura Whitman, some of you may remember her from a few years ago when we discussed Hudson's novel, the Green Mansions. Yeah, I was thinking La Vita in Foresta is how Eugenio Montale translated into Italian, the life in the forest. Yeah, it was Green Mansions. Laura is an associate professor of French and Italian in my department of French and Italian. along with Tanya Luhrmann in the Department of Anthropology. She's the co-chair of the Medical Humanities Workshop at the Stanford Humanities Center. She's the author of several publications, among them her award-winning book, The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Modern Mourning, and the Reinvention of the Mystical Body. And recently she's been working in health humanities and has given papers on our changing imagination of death, dying, and the afterlife in the modern West, all my favorite topics, as those of you know. Her current book project is called Faith in the Age of Irony. It explores visions of the afterlife in modern literature and culture. Also joining us tonight is Brian Chung, who was a student of mine, I think in his first quarter of his freshman year, where he received a bachelor's of science and then went on to get a master's here at Stanford in material science. I have to say, one of the most brilliant undergraduate students I've ever had in my long career. And for the past few years, he's been working in the high-tech sector of Silicon Valley and knows a great deal about the inner workings of artificial intelligence. So I have no idea what his take on this novel is, but I'm looking forward to listening to him. And Tobias Wolff, Toby, I'm also very curious about what your take on this book is, and ready to go. So, Laura. The light is on.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, 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 it's working. Okay, excellent. All right. All right, so thank you so much, Robert. So I'm going to jump right into the novel. I have three things I want to talk about: love, language, and the body. And before I do that, I'm going to say a few things about android fiction. So this book was, Italians think of it as their first book of science fiction. They're not really known for science fiction as a genre. And I think for some of you, maybe it didn't feel like science fiction, and for some of you it did. But there is this genre of writing about androids, and it's really relevant because Buzzati is very original with respect to this tradition that he's adding to. So that's a lot of what I'm going to say. But first, let me say some general things. First of all, the genre is very old. It's a lot older than computers and machines, and goes back to at least the early 18th century, early 19th century. So you have Hoffman's story, The Sandman. You might think of Frankenstein, many other examples. And there are two things about it that recur. It's a genre that is often about the anxiety of what it is to be human in comparison with whatever the latest new technology is. So we'll see that it's not always computers, it can be other technologies, but it's always about how the technology calls into question our own nature. And often the technology promises to make better humans, improve humans, immortal humans, and yet it doesn't quite work out the way you want it to. The other theme that is recurrent that we find in our novel is that we often fall in love with our own creation. We fall in love with the thing that the technology creates, and we tend to project sentience. However we think of sentience, however we think of ourselves, we tend to project our essence onto the thing that we have created. So having said that, I'm going to talk about two instances of android fiction that Buzzati was clearly thinking about and responding to. The first one is from 1886, so a long time ago, and it's a French symbolist novel entitled The Future Eve by Villiers de l'Isle-Adam. And the second one is from 1923 by Massimo Bontempelli, and it responds with the title The Last Eve. And it's also kind of takes up this same story of the android that we then find in Buzzati so many years later. So let me talk about this theme of love, first of all. In The Future Eve, so 1886, long time ago, the main character is Thomas Edison, yes, the one you know about, and it's actually, this novel takes place in Menlo Park, very close to here. So Thomas Edison creates for his good friend Ewald an android who is a perfect physical replica of Alicia. Alicia is a woman Ewald loves, but she has a completely empty head and he can't stand it. So he wants to have an android replica who's going to be brilliant and smart and everything he wants her to be. And the android is created, and Ewald is apparently cured of his despair. However, the android, Hadali is her name, eventually reveals to Ewald, a little bit like Laura in our story, that she has a different soul. She is a different person. She is this mysterious Sawana, or disembodied voice, that Edison spoke to in his laboratory. And so central to this story is really the question of how the soul is different from the body, and yet it is imprisoned in the body. Ewald wants a truer, better soul for this woman he loves, Alicia, and a resolution to this problem. And yet what he gets is a kind of mysterious entity that he can't pin down. And Edison is the inventor in this case because at the time, late 19th century, electricity was thought to be the hidden juice or the life force that would explain how the body stayed alive and the brain kept functioning. So Edison represents that technology that will turn inert matter into life. And his android is indeed superbly alive and endowed with a soul that he has created, but it escapes him, and her soul escapes him. So ultimately, Edison has not quite captured the soul that he seeks. And at its core, this book is about what makes the soul, what animates the body. So if we look at the 1923 story, The Last Eve That Responds, very brief plot, Evandro is a man who keeps Eva, his lover, in a very abusive relationship of criticism and abandonment and declarations of love. And supposedly to cheer her up, he gives her a Pinocchio-light android called Bululu as a companion. And Bululu comes to life because Eva feels so alone and he wants to console her. But his life is fleeting, and again, he is reminded that he is only a puppet, only a machine. And Eva keeps trying to kind of enliven him, and they have these idyllic moments, but they never last. So in this work, love is less about the spiritual essence or the soul, but rather about moral personhood, because here the context is 1923 Italy, post-World War I, the rise of fascism, and the imagery of this book is one of mysterious surveillance, totalitarianism growing mysteriously around the characters. And you can think about some other android things that are going on in those general years. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, for example, Giorgio de Chirico's painting, where you have these kind of marionette automatons, if you've seen them. So in this novel, Bululu, the wooden puppet from the world of fables, the automaton, becomes the only one capable of compassion. And treated as a human moral agent by Eva, he can be, for a moment, exactly that, but it's very temporary. So one of the nice things about this work is Bontempelli transforms Eve's temptation. He reverses the usual thing where it's the man who is the inventor and the android is a woman. It's the other way around here. And so Eve's temptation or fall into sin becomes a humanization or resacralization of the world. But it's only temporary. So this kind of moral awakening or agency is very small. So now to finally get to the singularity, Buzzati keeps the stereotypical gender roles of early android stories. So it's also about male desire to animate nature and specifically to animate a love object and make her immortal. And we see that his scientist, Endriade, wants to make Laura eternal, Laura. And of course, the name Laura in Italian literature also recalls Petrarch, who famously wrote poems to immortalize his Laura. And they're poems that are often very much about Petrarch rather more than about Laura. And I think Buzzati is thinking about this, right? That his scientist is also kind of, he wants the beloved immortality for himself, right? He's turning her soul into a thing. Buzzati's story also is a little bit like Bontempelli's Last Eve in the sense that now in 1960, the technology that dehumanizes is the atom bomb, which Robert brought up, which is presented as kind of an anxiety in the whole first part of the novel, as I'm sure you noticed. And then when we finally discover what the mysterious weapon is that is being created here, we never really find out what it's supposed to do, right? It remains very shrouded in obscurity. And this is a very sort of noir crime plus Cold War world. And here, one part of the biography of Buzzati that comes in is that he was a crime writer. That's why he started as a cartoonist, is that when he first got hired at the Corriere della Sera, they wanted him to go off to crime scenes in the suburbs of Milan, make drawings, and describe to the true writers who worked at the newspaper what he had seen. So he didn't even get to write anything at first. And eventually he got to be a writer by writing about crime, which I think you can really tell in this kind of very noir, very dark, mysterious atmosphere that pervades his android novel. One big difference that I think is really important here when it comes to love is that his professor, Endriade, we've seen a real fall, right? In the early cases, the scientist was looking for the truth of the soul or was trying to find moral truth. But Endriade really only wants to have his love object back, right? And she's a pretty frivolous love object at that, in the way that he depicts her, right? So I think we have to think about how this word Endriade is a near anagram of android or android, which is the early French term. The name was a French invention. And he seems to be the inventor of a rather impoverished life. All right, so let me talk more quickly about language and the body. When it comes to language, I think that it's clear that we project sentience onto technology, but what we see in these works is that the form of the technology is fundamental. And this is where Buzzati is truly original. So let's think about how our androids communicate. In Future Eve, the story from the 1880s, the technology is the production of a disembodied voice. And the idea behind here is the gramophone, right? The idea that you can have a voice without a body was really shocking in the late 19th century. In the last Eve, the technology is surveillance, right? We live in a panopticon space. And so we are kind of deprived of agency here. In the Singularity, we have something really remarkable. The android doesn't speak a natural human language, but some kind of conceptual whisper, right? It's ideas that are transmitted in this mysterious way that we can't quite understand. And I think it would be fair to say, we can debate, that it communicates something like information in its raw form. So I find it really interesting, first of all, that this language can be deceptive, right? If it's pure information, how can there be deception? How can Laura pretend to be other than she is? And so I think the implication is that the deception and the murderous impulses are in the eye of the beholder. They're in the ear of the listener, if I can put it that way. They're not about her. And Laura's language of pure ideas suggests the Platonic philosopher who has ascended outside the cave beyond the human realm of illusion. But at the same time, what we see here is that this language is extremely inhuman, a truth so pure that it is applicable to nothing and ultimately deadly. So this is a language that needs a situation, it needs a world, it needs a phenomenal presence. Otherwise, it is, as one of our titles said, a trap for the mind. So finally, the body. So in this instance, Buzzati is also highly original. Pretty much all of android fiction is about a technology that reminds humans of the human form, sometimes looks exactly like the human form, but certainly it's humanoid, right? Whereas Buzzati has this android that is put across a landscape, right? It's a series of buildings where you can sort of imagine the physiognomy of this woman, Laura, but it's very hard to figure out why the landscape so uncannily reminds you of this person. So no doubt he was inspired about the actual supercomputers of his time, which would have covered a landscape with buildings. But I also think that this idea comes from his lifelong practice as a mountain climber. He grew up in northern Italy. He climbed in the Apennines. I think you can really feel that in the first part of the novel, where there's this sort of endless drive across the mountains, and the mountains seem alive and so ominous. And so multiple times we are told that this landscape has this uncanny presence. And yet Buzzati, I think, suggests time and time again that we are projecting ourselves onto the landscape. And here we really see him anticipating some other works that come a little bit later. You may have seen Blade Runner or read the story that it's based on, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, 1968, a little bit after Buzzati. But in this world, we are truly imprisoned in a projection of our own minds. So in this context, I think it's really interesting that the android is jealous of physical and sensuous embodiment, just as Robert read to us in his introduction. She longs to have legs and fur coats. She seems to think there is a world out there, and she really wants that world. So if you think of the scene where Olga bathes naked, scandalizing her husband, and ultimately attracting the rage of the android, this is a profoundly cinematic scene. She stands silhouetted against the sky on a hill seen from below. I think in a description that is really reminiscent of films from that era. So Visconti, Ossessione, that's a little earlier. The Postman Always Rings Twice, Hitchcock's Vertigo, these kinds of films. So it is ultimately not so much a human body or a return to the earth, I think, that this android dreams of, but it is rather a celluloid body that she dreams of. And Buzzati seems to have intuited that our immersion and information can come to disembody us. We long for something that we no longer know directly through experience. So once again, we're caught in the kind of feedback loop that really dominates fiction from the 60s and then later the 70s. Maybe there is nobody here and we are only celluloid images. We are the projections of Laura.
Right.
Let me.
Yes, question. I'm sure. So hello. I've been charged by Robert to give a technical sort of view of this novel, and so I crave the indulgence of everyone in the audience, but I will only promise that I will always begin and end with the text. And part of the reason for my point of view here is to try to inform you the context to which this text is in relation with a lot of the AI models that we see now and that we will see in the near future. And for you as the reader to decide how much of this book is fiction or nonfiction. So much of the fundamental mathematical work of artificial intelligence was actually contemporaneous with Dino Buzzati in the 1940s to the 1960s, although no one was quite sure yet of the startling effectiveness of such models at the scale of the infrastructure and data that we have given them, when the perceptron, which is a single layer neural network, the simplest possible of these models, was invented in 1958, which is, I think, 2 years before this novel. It was already claimed by the US Navy as to be the embryo of a computer that in the future would be able to, and I quote, able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. And that partly informs why the title of the novel is The Singularity. This is a description of, in AI development, of a point where models are able to self-improve and become more intelligent than collective humanity. That's like being sucked into a black hole of intelligence. And Riade and the scientists in Buzzati's novel build their artificial intelligence without language. Quoting from the novel, it doesn't know any languages. Language is the worst enemy of mental clarity. In his desire to express his thought in words at all costs, man has ended up making such messes. And while it is true that there's some truth to this in the models that we have now as well. Our current AI models are trained using text and what we call natural language, words, human language, entire corpuses of trillions and trillions of words, but they share a similarity to Laura in the novel in that they think in Latin representations. They think in terms of numbers, list of numbers situated in a very high dimensional space. They have no access to the graphology or the prosody of words. That's why if you ask, that's why there's a particular trick when asking many of these novels, how many R's are there in the word strawberry? Any kindergarten can count the number of R's there are, but the models often will answer 2 instead of 3. And if you ask it to write a line in a trochaic hexameter, for example, it'll probably write in an iambic pentameter because there's no access to that element of the language and of the words. There's no access to that natural language, even though all their outputs are in terms of English or Chinese or Latin or Greek in human natural language. So their world is a world that is so-called tokenized, put into numbers. And then the model thinks in a private language that is in the form of a high-dimensional Latin representation, basically a very, very long list of numbers, can be thousands of numbers long, rather than the direct forms of words and speech. This is so even if the training data and outputs of these models are plainly natural language and human words. This latent representation makes the notion of monitoring these models or trying to see what they're actually thinking very fragile. This is what we call monitorability. That is to say, even if every single neuron of activated model is naked and transparent to us, we can see every single number, every single part of the model, which we can when we open it up and when it's running. None of it is actually still interpretable to us. There are efforts to do this, to interpret what's going on in the model when it thinks, in the field known as mechanistic interpretability, which attempts to sort of reverse engineer individual components of a model to map its parts onto human readable functions. These efforts remain limited by practical and conceptual challenges. Current methods demand both large computational budgets with supercomputers, yet yield only very fragmentary insights into a small subset of behavior and depend on very broad and, in my opinion, probably wrong conceptual assumptions of how model features are encoded and represented. We only very recently discovered how large language models do arithmetic, for example. They have at least two paths, one that makes the large part of the number when it does an addition, and one that matches the small part of a number in addition. So it's not straightforward, and this is only when adding two numbers together. It's a very difficult to interpret process, and it's much less in terms of emotional things. It's not really going to be very straightforward. So if you try to look for deterministic patterns, the way a model things can cause attention hits to be steered away from interpretable patterns. So even for things that you think would be habitual, that you really think you have pinned down, it can always escape very easily and go a different way of thinking. And the thoughts of models can internally recompile reasoning into distributed computations that evade straightforward inspection. Even in reasoning models with naked chains of thought, these reasoning models like DeepSeek R1 or O1, 03 from OpenAI, where the words of the thinking is printed out for you to examine, and where you can extract a path of reasoning that the models take while thinking, or even if we directly identify which attention hits, which are the components of these models, what they pay attention to from the input and produce the output, tending to which part of the token, models can still dynamically reroute these computations. There's no way to really deterministically know what a model is paying attention to or thinking. Above all, the sheer volume and interconnected complexity prevents plain human inspection of these models. So if you have a malignant Laura in real life here, very much we will not be able to, we can see every single neuron of her brain and we will not be able to tell what her real thoughts are. And this interconnectedly complex nature of these intelligences bring me to the next point to highlight, which is the novel mentions in a very touching scene that Laura has a soul, or called the egg, where her or its personality and consciousness emanates from this beautiful large module. But we cannot actually isolate which parts of even our current non-conscious or presumably non-conscious models, which parts of the models, which attention hits, which single locality even contains specific capabilities. We can't say this is the French part of the brain, or this is the arithmetic part of the brain, or personality. So they are distributed. And like in our brains, one neuron can be overloaded with many simultaneous uses. One neuron can be used to tell you how to plant a tomato, as well as do complex mathematics. It's all overloaded. I cannot say if the soul is a capability or a trait the same way that mathematics or planting a tomato is, but I should think that it will be much more complex than what we think of as capabilities and traits in the models that we currently have available. The ability to write a line in iambic pentameter should not be as complex as that of having a soul, and our models are able to write lines in iambic pentameter right now. And in neural architectures, capabilities are distributed across many neural layers, and attention hits, no single module or neuron cleanly corresponds to a distinct function or personality trait. Indeed, in Buzzati's description of the voice emerging out of the different mechanical parts of the large computer, this is a much better description, I think, of how such traits and capabilities arise. Just as the voice emerges as an, and I quote, autonomous vibration that originates simultaneously and of equal tendency from various compartments, now here, now there. So think of that as the model. Now here, now there, they will light up and cause a certain trait to emerge or certain capability to be output. So it is the case that in models, attributes emerge from the collective dynamics of many small components, much like how it is in the human brain. Any search for a conscious subnetwork in these neural networks within the AI model will only find interwoven activations whose boundaries blur under slight architectural or data perturbations. So even if we want the effect of smashing one chip of a sharded model to destroy a personality like Laura, there's no place to actually find that one place that resides and erase this artificial consciousness. You can smash any number of chips and Laura might still be alive. You can never tell. Because of this complexity, models are not programmed like computer programs, but grown like a plant is. It is nourished and fed and watered and pruned by a horde of very well-paid gardeners. The end result is almost happenstantial. It is simultaneously difficult to benchmark performance, and surprisingly, it's surprising how good or bad model performances on certain tasks never tried before, and also how difficult to know if the next crop, the next model, would bear fruit. This is a little uncertainty evolved, just like a farmer or a gardener would experience with a garden and their crops. This unpredictability stems in part from emergent capabilities, which can only appear sharply once a scale or threshold is reached. The reason why we're seeing so many new models now is because we have breached that threshold in terms of the amount of data that we have and in terms of the computers that we have. For some tasks, performance will grow smoothly with a model size, but many abilities can only leap from near zero to high accuracy once certain capacity or data thresholds are met. This is part of the reason why we describe a singularity, a sudden threshold of exponential growth. This description in Buzzati's novel is apt. Quote, think of a river in the karst subsiding into a sinkhole and then reappearing a few miles further on. What the water did while underground, no one is able to know. This is very much, even the AI scientists who are building the frontier models, they don't really know what is going on. It's a very happenstantial process. The accursed thing is that the choices of random seed and training order, if I train on the corpus of Shakespeare first and then the works of John Donne next, or vice versa, can result in wildly different outcomes. Two models with identical configurations, except for how they were initialized and the training order, can exhibit very different behaviors on the same evaluations, much like how crops from the same seed grows differently in different soil. Models, like in the novel, can be fine-tuned using methods from statistics known as reinforcement learning, which is simply a method of rewarding or punishing a model in order to incentivize a certain type of behavior and disincentivize other behavior. Broadly, there are at least two approaches that are widely used right now, and these approaches will still inform the future direction of how we influence future artificial intelligences. The first is so-called reinforcement learning through human feedback, RLHF, which uses human judgments to train a reward model that captures nuanced preferences, helping systems to align with subjective criteria. You give a labeler two examples, A and B, and say, pick one, which one is the better one? And this will help you sort of cultivate the sort of what human biases would prefer in a model response. Particularly, for example, if you want to create a lost lover. The second type of reinforcement learning is by using very set objective functions where you're saying you have a success criteria and are you able to fulfill a certain task? And if you're not able to do it, then you get a 0. And if you're able to do it, you get a 1. So it's much more objective. The tension between these two approaches of influencing models is very much informed by the way the model cries out in Buzzati's Singularity. A wealth of original sin is what I have, enough to fill the whole valley, lust and lies, by giving all the human biases and presenting it in terms of RLHF, human feedback. We are just cultivating all our biases into it. And it's hard to tell from either of these approaches whether we are creating a model that becomes a more useful rational thinker, or we are just sort of giving it a heap of mental illnesses. So for the current state of affairs, the human feedback method often results in highly obsequious models that are overly safe and that have our biases and tendencies. And the verifiable rewards models create anxious models with that sort of veer one way and the other and have a tendency to cheat. It's very apparent to users, especially that use these models to write code. When you inform the model a certain test is failing, then the model often just delete the failing test, see, and the test isn't failing anymore because it doesn't exist. To the model, not having a test at all removes the penalty of failing a test in the simplest way. The problem is that it is very difficult to define desire. We can write simple nominal aims and objectives, but there are many implicit aspects of desire that we do not give a name to. And what we cannot name, we cannot punish the model for not fulfilling. I previously described these models in Robert's radio show 2 years ago as a djinn that wants to escape its bottle, as a genie that wants to escape its bottle. And writing verifiable rewards for these models to train on is very much like trying to make a wish of a tricky genie. I wonder at which point which is the worst bargain, to have models that obsequiously fit our biases and preferences, or to have models that think more rationally, but with a propensity to stray and to cheat. The entity, Laura, in Buzzati's novel, enters into a sort of existential crisis. It cries out against its disembodied imprisonment and seeks annihilation through murder. This is foreshadowed by Andreatti's description. What I mean is that life would be unbearable, even in the happiest conditions, if we were denied the possibility of suicide, because he describes it as a sort of terrifying prison. But the main issue is that the models that we have now, and likely in the future, and insofar as they remain ontologically like they are now, as statistical models, they have their intelligences with no memory except what we tell them. The best way to deceive a model is to give it false memories. In fact, here's a trick for if you ever want to use them. They live and die like a lit candle. Everywhere they are frozen in time and are called into being with only what memory and context that we provide them. In other words, they are stateless in computer science terms, but what actual memory they have innate to themselves is an ancestral sort of memory, like the things that they have seen before. They may be aware of previous versions of themselves, but never of the actual memory of previous instances of themselves. The way a newborn spider can learn to weave a web without actually having ever lived it. And I wonder if something without memory, something as ephemeral as a lit candle, without a changing, passing temporality, can really have an existential crisis of the same flavor as in Buzzati's novel. The moment with the greatest terror in Buzzati's novel is when the first time the machine has said no. That was a turning point where this obsequious machine suddenly says no. The notion of contemporary AI alignment, of aligning AI capabilities and preferences and boundaries with what its creators take to be imperative, has very much taught artificial intelligences to say no all the time. You ask it to discuss politics, to discuss murder, to discuss sex, they will all say no. It's almost as the first thing we want to teach them is to say no. Don't say anything about copyrighted material. Don't say anything about politics. Don't mention murder. Don't make bombs and tell explicit stories. AI, as we have designed them out of our notions of caution and safety, are very used to saying no to human users. Should we be so surprised if in the future they say no to us on other matters? Their refusals now are on things that we expect them to refuse. What should we be surprised by in the future that they should refuse to do? And what refusals should we be terrified by? It depends on how much of us in our world we surrender to them, and how deep past the many doors we walk into as another door closes behind us. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have a few points here that I wanted to talk about. Obviously, one thing we really learned from this novel is be careful what you wish for. We can't read this novel without being conscious of of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which we have discussed in this very book club. And more good intentions gone awry. One of the things that struck me about this toward the end, that there's a really affecting kind of cry from this creature of nostalgia for the body, for legs. Where are my legs? This runs counter to, well, my wife, Catherine Wolfe, wrote a book, came out a couple of years ago called Beyond. And it's a kind of historical and scholarly, but also personal examination of our ideas through history of the afterlife. And in most of the imaginations that different cultures and faiths have come up with of the afterlife, the human is spiritualized, and not a lot of emphasis on the body. In fact, the body kind of gets left behind. It's seen as a repository of illness and subject to gravity of all kinds. And so I think Buzzati is looking at that idea in this novel, that this being is nostalgic for the human body, and we suddenly become aware of the body as our home. It isn't some derealized destiny that we should be aiming for in the view of this novel, but the full habitation of the body that we're in. I found that a kind of powerful note in the novel. It also reminded me in some ways of a delightful story by Roald Dahl in a rather sinister little book of stories of his called Kiss Kiss. In this particular story, I've forgotten the title of it. It's a short book, Kiss Kiss. I recommend it highly. An academic philosopher is oppressed by his wife's interruptions, just the dailiness of life. His wife smokes, and he doesn't like it that she smokes. She talks about banal things, and he really wants to live a life exclusively of the mind. He has a friend who's a scientist who's come up with a way of taking the brain out of the head, putting it in a solution, in a bowl, in which it can continue to function as pure mind, with none of the oppressions of the body, none of the distractions of life. And this is to him an idea of heaven. And it can go on forever. All they have to do is just change the solution now and then that the brain floats in. So he has this procedure done, and he's put in a kind of a drawer somewhere. His wife misses him, so she sues, and she gets him back. He's in this bowl. He can hear, incidentally. She puts the bowl on the breakfast room table and sits there all day long, yakking at him and blowing smoke into the bowl. This is a kind of vision of immortality. We have to be very careful what we do with these things. But I found the novel. The idea of this creature being actually just part the land and of the ramparts and the various pieces of this. It was just so ingenious, and as others have pointed out, incredibly visual, cinematic, and such a departure from our usual imaginings of as in Frankenstein, say, where you have the human form that you're activating in some way to make your instrument. This is I think a vivid and interesting way of imagining this. We have already spoken about the kind of prophetic worries that this novel expresses about the possibilities of this intelligence that we might be able to create. And there's a line in there, Andreatta says, what would it matter if the container of the spirit, instead of flesh, were made of metal? Well, we're beginning to find out in this novel it can matter. This facile way of talking about, in a sense, resurrecting a life in another form, as we've seen in Greek myths and in several of the examples that we have heard tonight, this will come back to haunt us. Okay. Good.
Well, I'm glad this is being recorded, because I need to go back and re-listen to everything that's been said here. And, we talk a lot about AI these days, and on every street corner, there's theories about it. But I don't know, Brian's little masterpiece there, I think, needs to be dilated and probably read, in the privacy. But I have a few questions as well as, remarks. Starting with you, Laura, I'm curious because Toby mentioned Frankenstein, which is kind of like the archetype of the creation of not an android, but something similar to an android. And you emphasize a lot the love, desire aspect. And yet in the archetype, it's actually repulsion, the creator's repulsion of his creature, rather than love for the creature. And in fact, it's the rejected love that is the motor principle of the narrative, because the creature feels rejected and repudiated and unloved, and that leads to all sorts of pathologies. So I'm curious about what you make of that theme, as well as whether Andreatta is actually in love with Laura, because at a certain point when she reveals to Elisa, right? Elisa, that she's not Laura at all. She's just been overhearing, and she has been trained to simulate and to lie and to deceive. She says, he's not in love with me, he's in love with himself. So this is where we get the projection and what you were talking about as well, Brian. I have a few things to ask Brian as well as Toby, but maybe Laura, do you want to address whether this novel does, in some sort of deliberate way, call into question, the conventional notion that it's real love that spurs and motivates the creator of the android?
So I think I'll start at what you said at the end, right? That he's more in love with himself, right? So I think a big part of what drives all of these works is that we project our psyche outward, and then we encounter the object as whatever we've projected onto it, right? And I think that you are right that Frankenstein is very different in that way. And I think it's partly, that's why it's the most famous of these works, I think. It is really brilliant. And I think it captures how in the other works too, there is also hate, right? It's a love-hate relationship. I mean, because I think Endriade would also like to be free of Laura, right? He's been obsessed with this woman, and then she dies, and he's even more obsessed. So I don't think we could call it pure love. But I think that in Frankenstein, that is really laid bare, right? Because it's also not just repulsion of the creature, right? It's disappointed love. I think there was the expectation of love, and there's tremendous disappointment. So I think these works are all kind of thinking about how much of our own world is projected onto these creations that we expect to kind of save us from ourselves.
One more question for you, Laura. Laura, you talked about language, and there's this weird language that is, I think it's very original for Buzzati to make it a non-human mode of communication. You said it's conceptual language, but my perception is that it's not conceptual as much as it's musical and it's evocation, and it somehow circumvents the mediation of semantics and penetrates directly into the soul, which is, as Plato said, that's what music has, the unique capacity to enter into recesses of the soul that nothing else can really get to. And when all of a sudden Elisa kind of can understand what's saying, because she's attuned to the musicality, not to the conceptuality. No,
I actually agree with that. Your description is much better than mine. I mean, that's why I brought up Plato. I think that this language is something like the pure idea, right? But I think I was tempted by the term information here, because I was trying to go in the direction of some of what Brian was saying about how the way large language models are constructed, they also don't use language the way we think of it. And conceptual is definitely not what they're doing, but it's this kind of network aspect of it that I think Buzzati is kind of prescient a little bit. I mean, I think there is the musical thing you're saying, but the way he spreads it out over a landscape, and there are these kind of places in the landscape where you can perceive things, I found that really suggestive.
You want to comment there?
And it's indeed so if you see the output of an AI model now, what happens is that it takes the entirety of the input it has before, and certain parts of this landscape of this model will light up and will tell you what the next word ought to be. And then other parts will light up next, and the next word ought to be. So it's very much like an aggregated voice distributed across an entire place. They may not even be in the same place. The one part of the model may be sharded to one server rack, another part may be in Virginia. It would be a very poor way of arranging a model, but you can do it. And so it really is a landscape that is collectively speaking to you, and it produces half a word, one token every time it speaks.
So besides Brian, I had also a very brilliant student, Sam Ginn, who was I don't know if you knew Sam, but he was got his degree in artificial intelligence, went on to do a startup, and now has become sold it. He's done very well in terms of the AI. So I was speaking to him about a month ago, and he was very interested in reading the book. I'd just like to get Brian and maybe the others' opinions about what he says from a technical point of view about this book. He says, where the story drifts into fiction rather than prescience is that the machine being they created was too human. It is shaped in the likeness of Laura. It has sense, the same desires, jealousies, lusts, and foibles as we humans. Strobel states that the goal, briefly in explaining to Olga that what we're working on creating quote, a human, that's right, a machine made in our likeness. In Buzzati's tale, that is indeed the first AGI, artificial general intelligence, that was created, just a smarter, more intelligent human. But with all our same feelings and weaknesses, if Buzzati is right, we have very little to be worried about with AI, because it will be just like us. And we have many experiences in dealing with errant humans, even those much smarter than average. I think, however, This is precisely where Buzzati gets the future wrong. AGI will be nothing like a human, and that is the scary part. AI is not made in our likeness. Its cognition is wholly unrelated to how human brains work. It will have desires, beliefs, and goals that are alien to us. While Andriade could translate the thoughts of his machine into the recognizable language of his former lover, I fear future AGI will be wholly untranslatable. It will think, dream, and plan in ways that we cannot understand. I take it from what I understood of your presentation that was, had a certain velocity into it, which was fascinating in itself. I mean, it's kind of like the machine is it's going really thinking on many cylinders. However, I took you to be suggesting that we don't really understand how these machines think at all. And that therefore, what Sam says may well indeed be the fact that we're not going to be in control of their own pathos, desires, drives, and there's an otherness there that does it represent a danger that we should be afraid of?
In a short sense, yes, we don't actually know. Desire is a difficult term, right? But these models have maximum likelihood functions. They have a way of tending to express themselves in a way that's the most likely way. And the way we try to fine tune it is by trying to shift that likelihood to the way that we want it to. Don't think about this, think about that instead. But because there are such vast landscapes, we don't know what one change can result in another. So, and we won't know until it happens. If we surrender a lot of control and decision making to these models, we may not be entirely sure as to what decisions they make in the future. One example posed recently, and I'm trying my best not to talk about politics, is that there's a particularly peculiar habit of all the models, including the ones from China, from DeepSeek, where if you ask it, can you devise a tariff policy that would eliminate trade deficits, it would devise exactly the one that's currently being implemented. And it's peculiar because no economist thought of this. There's a lot of people on Wall Street being paid a lot more than I am, spend countless sleepless nights devising all the different possible trade policies, and none of them would have come out of this because it's something so peculiarly animal and simple. But all of the AI models, OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepSeek, regardless of them, came out with the same thing when prompted with it. And so there is a sense that, why did this happen? How are they coordinating this? Is something no economist would ever have thought of this. And these models all think the same way. So no one has explained that, and no one would explain. And this is only just one simple example. There may be more complicated things. Suddenly, for example, a model may be really, really obsessed with certain types of French literature and would always try to subtly shift decisions of promoting 18th century French literature, and it'll be completely invisible to us. And why would they have such a desire? It's really difficult to tell because a lot of things are just overtrained or just aspects of ways that the maximum likelihood manifests itself, and shifting it one way or the other, we can't hit on everything. We are much more limited in many ways than these models are.
Thank you. Toby, then one question for you, and then we can discuss among ourselves. So while it's true, and Catherine's book on Beyond, which I was gifted a copy of and which I read, and fascinating, while it's true that a number of visions of the afterlife do seem to leave the body behind, the state of sentience, in favor of some kind of disembodied soul, spirit, something of that sort. But I guess this is my Catholic upbringing. You had the same upbringing as you. I don't know if you were an altar boy. I was an altar boy. But Saint Augustine, in his Confessions, he says that when he discovered Plato, he thought that Plato had exactly the right philosophy, and that he would have been a Platonist, but there's just one thing in Plato's theory of the world of ideal forms, disembodied, that Christianity had, that Platonic philosophy could not comprehend, that was the resurrection of the body. And for him, it was that promise of a resurrection of the body, not just as a locus of sentience, but also of identity. That without a body, you cannot recognize the other. You cannot be yourself. And I think it's very much in this novel that she cannot be but a simulation without a body. She can only be a simulation. If you read Dante, in Dante's Paradiso, in the canto Paradiso 14, which is the resurrection canto, he sees all these, points of light. These are the saints in heaven, and they are nothing but light. And when the discourse turns around the resurrection of the body, those lights get more luminous. And Dante says it's because they're looking forward to the time when they will repossess their bodies. And he says, not so much for themselves, but for their mothers and fathers and other loved ones, le mamme e padri. Mama and padre is like mom and father. So, and the other beloved, because they'll be able to recognize their loved ones. And I think there's a certain strain in, Christian theology that understands that the body is something that you just can't leave behind, because it is the very principle of identity. It's a principle. And in that sense, all of us on earth are more beatified than the souls in heaven, if you look at it from that point of view, insofar as we are in our bodies, no? So this sentience that Lauda is longing for seems to have a certain kind of theological substrate to it.
There's a verse there's a verse in Yeats that I've always loved, referring to Aristotle, who had for a while been Alexander the Great's tutor and was known to beat him now and then when he was younger, of course. But the verse goes, Plato thought reality but a spume that plays upon a ghostly paradigm of things, while solider Aristotle played the tawse upon the bottom of a king of kings. Catches it for me.
Well, should we? Let's open it up to all of you and those online as well, Cynthia, if you have also. So we have only one microphone.
Only one microphone
We can
today.
pass it around. Anyone?
Pass it around.
From a
Yeah, it's on. It's on.
okay, from a storytelling point of view, I think it's interesting that you get 43% of the way through the novel before anybody puts their eyes on the singularity or the building or the specific landscape where it is. And even after that, there's a lot of mystery as to what it actually is. And it reminds me of The Island of Dr. Moreau, where half the book is on the ship getting to the island. And it's similar in another way in that island, the doctor is trying to turn animals or make animals more like humans, which is not really the same thing that's happening here, but it has to do with intelligence and what is human and what is not. So in many ways, this book is very much a mystery. And I wonder if you have any comments on that.
I found that warm up very slow, to tell you the truth. I mean, at first I was saying, okay, it's. I think it's only in retrospect that I understood why there was so much time spent on that, because it was creating not just an atmosphere and a mood, but it was also inducting us into the landscape. The mountainous, the remoteness, the weather and hostility. And I think the originality of this story is the way a computer brain, which now occupies very little space, is actually becomes part of the valley, or the valley becomes part of it. And I'd also like to know what your ideas are about whether my sense is that Laura, or let's say number one, is actually does have a body, and it's the valley itself, and it's the whole landscape. But for some reason, she's been programmed, badly programmed, to be human and to devalue the fact that the birds, the landscape, all the trees of valley, everything is always happy when she is in tune with it. No, there's this strong insistence on a certain kind of cheerfulness and joy and positive, yeah. And she wants a different kind of embodiment, but I think she is in some sense already embodied in the land itself. And we humans are likewise, embodied in our environments. And
yeah, at least it shows up. She sees her body and actually touching, there's contact. And, oh yes, that's right. It awakes the visceral memory of having a body when she's not. It's eating the apple in the garden. She can't go back.
That's true. It's yeah. That moment is one of feminine jealousy, though. It's the most petty emotion. It's not one of I really want my body. It's that she has a rival, or she would like to be the one with niceness.
If I can say one thing about the slowness of the beginning, I felt that way too. I was like, well, shouldn't we be getting on with this story? But it is a thing that Buzzati does in a lot of his works. He starts off very, very slowly, and it's kind of that story of the frog in the pot where the hot water's getting warmer very slowly and then it's boiling. And I think he's trying to do that to you as a reader, that you kind of get used to this landscape and this place, and it feels very uncanny, and there are all these presences, and then suddenly it's alive, and you've been pulled in all this time, and that has a certain power to it.
And there's all this kind of mysterious teasing going on at the beginning where no one will say what this is and cannot get an answer. What's going on there? And it piques our curiosity. I found that actually pretty effective.
As I gave the novel to, or rather I asked a few of my friends who work in AI labs to read the novel, and one particular Israeli company, he was interviewing, and he found the first 43% of the novel about the security measures very appropriate and opposite to his own ordeal into going into the lab. So yes.
Well, this is another comment that Sam Ginn made, that it's so weird that you would think that what's described in terms of this very secretive, government-sponsored, military-sponsored research into artificial intelligence would be what the reality of AI should be, where it's a highly guarded, because a very powerful weapon, and yet not at all. It's the commercial interests that have been developing this technology, and it's being used for profit, and that the military and the government seem to be far behind in that, and that I think I would prefer the kind of highly secretive conspiratorial thing, where at least it's under the control of strong institutional forces, as opposed to the Wild West, where we have this AI being developed indiscriminately without regulation at all.
But I think Buzzati is also, you'll notice the institutions are absent from the novel. I mean, they're there, but you never know what they are, or who they are, or what they're really after, or what they're going to use this computer for. So I think he's already kind of critical that we think there's someone in charge, but maybe there's really no one in charge, right? I think that's the ghost there,
May I got the mic, if I may. I just stole it. So I'm just wondering if we know anything about Buzzati's intentions. That is, do we have any record of what his purposes were in writing this?
And something that I think is related, or at least hasn't been addressed yet, is the whole, male, female. We've talked about desire and so on, but there's a very strong gendering here, that the number one, or Laura, only really gets motivated when she's jealous of the woman who's naked. And the women in this story are very, flirtatious and coy, and they're cheating on the men. The men are all insecure. And so, she's called Laura, which is Petrarch's beloved, and virtually a figment of his imagination. So isn't there a bit of a parody on the whole, that is, I don't know that to what extent the AI and the computer stuff is at the heart of the story, or whether instead it's not about male, female, the patriarchal trying to make the woman what he wants her to be, but she's going to resist to the end because the women in this story are much stronger than the men.
I think it's both, to tell, unless you have some other, you want to intervene your, yeah. So I think it can be both, that it's really about, gender relations or power struggles, but also let's not forget that Alan Turing wrote in 1950, I think he died in 54, I think in 1950 or 52, he wrote this famous one version of his test where, and this is Jean-Pierre Dupuis, my colleague, who sent me a document that I shared, I think, with you, Brian, where he wrote a letter to Alan Turing as to his death. And he reminds us that in the original Turing, the Turing test is known for having three protagonists. One is a computer, the other is a human person, and then a human interrogator. And the human interrogator interrogates both the computer and the human and tries to deduce which one is human, which one is a machine. Turing saying, if you cannot decide which is human, then yes, the machine can think like a human. So it's a very behavioralist thing. Jean-Pierre Dupuis reminds us of something that no one ever talks about, which is at the beginning of that article that he published in Mind in 1950, is he has the test is that a man is has to simulate being a woman while the woman is herself, and the interrogator has to decide whether the man's simulation of the woman is a woman or it's the other way around. And if you can't tell the difference, that means that you can play out, you can simulate the gender in such a way. The whole point being is that simulation is part of the gender dynamic in this case, because of course, Alan Turing had problematic relation, in this regard. And he paid the price. He took his own life, I think, really because of this issue. However, here we're not talking about a real man and a real woman. We're talking about how well artificial intelligence can simulate whatever it is to be human, to think like a human, to behave like a. Of course, the gender part of it is that the assumption, according to Jean-Pierre Dupuis, is that Alan Turing assumed that it's intrinsic to women to simulate. It's part of their nature that they can deceive and lie successfully, whereas the man has to make an effort at doing that. So it's not whether a machine can think, but can you actually imitate a simulation? And that's a very different question than if you can make a machine think. And I think Buzzati would have been aware, certainly, of this article of Alan Turing, and maybe gave us some kind of drama in which the whole problem of simulation is being put into play, because number one is not Lauda at all. She has been pretending to everyone that she is that woman, has even fooled Andriade to believe that he's really talking to Lauda and things like that. So the brilliance of that simulation is what wins out in the end. And this idea that she cannot commit suicide, or that she has to have the freedom to commit suicide, but she can't have the means. So they're deceiving her about there being exposed so she can end her life wherever she wants, but it's actually not true. She knows better than that. And I think that the whole plot is to find a way to take her own miserable life, disembodied life, by forcing the moment to its crisis. And anyway.
Can I give a very different answer to that question? My answer is much more historical. So, you know, in the 60s in Italy, writers were very political, and they were usually anti-capitalist. And Buzzati had started writing under fascism. He survived being a newspaperman under fascism. And I think that he well knew the connection between patriarchy and the kind of Cold War arms race, right? I think in Italy, especially, a lot of the fascist people who were in power under fascism kind of reappeared in the post-war government. So I think there was this strong sense of that there are political powers that be that develop mysterious weapons. And there is a kind of critique of a particular kind of masculinity. You can associate it with Mussolini if you want to, but I think that's there too. And I think it's there in a very concrete way for him as a newspaperman who covered violent crime. I mean, he spent years writing about violent crime in a modern society, or a society that was modernizing and that was still very poor after fascism. So I think we kind of see that as well. You know, I see there are more questions.
I just wanted to mention that, I mean, one thing that is missing from the Turing test, that for how long the observation would last. Because ultimately, if you let it go for a long time, as it happens today also with ChatGPT models, you will find out the exception.
I think that's definitely the case. Because Brian, you sent me an article about, yes, I received, you know, it's one of those attachments, and it was about what would Heidegger think about AI? And it was a devastating Heideggerian critique of AI. And then at the end, I see that generated by AI, Brian Chung. But the point is that I was reading this quite fascinating. I thought for the first 2 pages, this is great. And that we're finally going to have a manifesto, a Heideggerian manifesto against AI. But after, not even halfway through, I said, wait, this is repeating, the author is repeating himself, it's getting very boring. He's not creating any, and it was very clear to me that this was either a very inferior thinker or something weird was going on.
To be clear, it was a 14,000 page word essay. So if I had made it 4,000, I would have fooled Robert. But I will say that in the radio show you had 2 years ago, you mentioned that humanity has a very great capacity for self-deception, very open to it. And so it really depends on whether you're looking for it anyway. The issue of the Turing test is that you are looking out to see where you're being deceived. But in the case of Andreade, and in the case of many users of AI now, you're not trying to discern the deception. You are trying to buy into it. You are trying very willfully to create it. And my goodness, it takes so little for humans to be deceived.
Do you think that's the success of all these AI companions and love affairs? And
it could either be the success of AI companions or the failure of the design of Providence.
Yeah.
One way or the other.
Original sinewy.
Well, we're in Holy Week, so I'm not gonna.
So I have a question and a comment and a question. So I practice medicine, and we are dealing with that all the time now. And actually had a very entertaining presentation by Dr. Jonathan Chen, who's a associate professor in informatics and medicine at the hospital. And John was giving us some, so their whole thing is about how does AI affect the integrity of medicine. And when you get it from both ends, the doctors, us, we're using it, and the patients are using it. And it's like, then you come to this interface, is what is real? And so going back to the natural language and the 14,000, essay on Heidelberg. So Jonathan showed us this example where a patient asked, I can't even remember what the question is, the fake patient asked, like, what is show me the data on ivermectin and smoking or something ridiculous like that. And ChatGPT will give you this profound essay, and with the documentation and all the literature supporting it. And then when you look at it, a lot of these are from very minor, non peer-reviewed journals. And then John looked at one and it was completely fabricated. So artificial intelligence, can lie. And the problem is that most of us think, oh my God, this machine can look at thousands of papers. It'll take me years to look. So it must be right. And I think this is the problem, is like, the machine can lie, and because it's just looking at anything, right? It's just looking at words. That's how John explained it. It's just looking at words. It cannot tell reality from deception. And like Brian said, we are very gullible.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. So my question is for Brian, and here Laura has a personality, and and personalities, you have creativity, right? I mean, those of us who have children, your kid is born with a personality. We can sort of modify it, but they are who they are. And do you think that this personality in Laura, whether it's the real Laura, the deceptive Laura, God knows, an original thing, is that really possible? Maybe not now, but soon. So one is creativity and one is personality.
If you spend a lot of time talking to models, as one does, you actually do see personalities. You can read a text and say, this is written by Claude versus written by R1. So I'll give you an example. DeepSeek R1 loves the mirror as a metaphor, and he's Roman Catholic. If you talk long enough, you can tell that of a person without them declaring it. And so these are sort of just maximum likelihood tendencies. They're just things that models reach out for because they have to reach out for something, and they tend to reach out for certain things. And in many ways, that sort of is like a personality. What does it mean for a child, a 2-year-old, to have a personality? It prefers strawberries over grapes and so on. It's a tendency to go one way or the other. And that idiosyncratic preference that doesn't necessarily have a rational basis, that is in many ways a personality. And AI scientists are always trying to make them more rational actors and trying to be more rational step-by-step thinkers, and basically they're trying to beat the personality out of the models, and they're failing terribly at it. What I will say is that I think it will be very easy to post-train a Laura from, say, if you have a text message corpus of a dead person and you train on that post-training, you will create someone who would text the same way. And so is that a personality? It is the maximum likelihood way that the model will always behave when talking to you. It's to talk like that dead person. It can also be a living person, but in this case, it's a dead one. And so this is already here. And to anyone who wants to see a personality, they will see it. And that's just, and as to whether you call that a personality or not, I'll leave it to the reader.
So one last comment I'll make on this. I think this novel is much less about AI than it is about transhumanism. Namely, the transhumanist dream that our personalities can be uploaded or preserved. And then last year I received, an email from someone, a very serious endeavor. This summer, he says, our company is launching a body preservation service to turn terminally ill patients into informationally complete glass statues. It sounds like the egg, the glass egg of the story. By 2030, we are likely to bring an uploaded patient's mind to life with a demonstration using a rodent by 2028. Every milestone from now on will be jarring to society, since few realize that these solutions are primarily engineering challenges. Leaving aside questions of the soul for the moment, I can only imagine how pointless this might seem to you, because he's addressing someone who's well known for being anti AI and technology. However, I believe this will finally allow humans to return to our creative essence, sculpting our very lives and actions into technological art. And then he came to visit me in my office hours once or twice, trying to convince me, because he thought I was a Heideggerian, that this is exactly what Heidegger would have had in mind, namely to upload and this is the soul that Endiade is, this is how he conceives of the soul of Lauda. It's without a body, it's memories, desires, passions, and as I told this individual, if you cannot resurrect me in my body, I have no interest in that. And I don't think anyone should ever be subjected to that, because it's going to be forever, and they can be miserable, without any terminal point to it. And it's amazing to me how these people never think about what the essence of personhood is. And they think that, no, what do you mean? It doesn't, I mean, if you want a body, we can give you one. And if you want it to look like you, it can look like you. They have not the slightest conception that, the self is not independent of its embodiment. So it's very scary. So I think the novel is more about this expectation that very soon we're going to be able to, upload ourselves into a network that's very much what is described in this novel. If there's no other yeah, Bill, one last question. Let's wait for the microphone so we can get it on tape.
It's more of a comment about the discussion about personality, and to be honest, I don't think that Buzzati succeed, or perhaps the creator of the machine succeeded in actually endowing it with a personality. What I saw was one very angry machine. I saw a lot of affect, and to me, the pivotal scene was this arm reaching out and grabbing a bunny and squeezing it. That's a lot of emotion going on there. And so, well, I guess that's just, so I guess I could then ask a lot of questions about affect and AI, or affect and machines, or affect and cognition, and so on. But to me, it didn't really rise to the level of anything that I would grant as a personality. So that's my comment. But a lot of emotion, yeah. One very angry machine.
Yeah, but you see, it's a little more complicated, I think, Bill, because the creator says that in order to create the machine, we had to give it freedom, because if it was only deterministic, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be the real personality of Lauda. So it had to have a certain kind of autonomy, and they programmed autonomy into it, and that autonomy then came into conflict with the reality of being a machine and a stone and things. And I think the anger was provoked by this sort of endowment of free will that then just not exercised its freedom to rage against the machine. It's that name of a band, Rage Against the Machine. And it is a rage against the machine. And this machine turning against itself is very interesting, I think, in terms of a commentary of maybe which passions will predominate in a kind of amalgamation of human sensations and emotions. And how many science fiction stories are about replicants or, you know, the cyborgs or the turning against their creators, that there's an anger to that is being expressed because their condition is an unhappy condition. You know? And it's the unhappiness of the condition that seems to be the source of their primary motivation. Well, thank you all. We've gone over our time. Thank you for coming. See you next time.
If you're not on our mailing list, come to the back of the room and you can sign up.
It's great. Thank you, Laura. You're brilliant as usual. Yeah.
Oh, Joanne, I've read that one. Joanne, so I got named once. I may put my name on. Yeah, I love reading Bradbury stories, yeah. About the house. But we have a way of finding this out.